The morning mist hung low over the airbase as Captain Sarah Chen adjusted her flight helmet for the third time. Her hands moved with practiced precision, checking every buckle and connection point, but inside her chest, her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. Today wasn't just another training mission or routine patrol. Intelligence reports had confirmed enemy aircraft movements near the border, and her squadron had been placed on high alert. Sarah had been flying fighter jets for 8 years, longer than most of the men in her unit, but she still felt the familiar weight of skeptical glances whenever she walked through the hangar. At 5 feet 4 inches tall, with her dark hair pulled back in regulation style, she looked more like a college student than a combat pilot. The other pilots in her squadron had grown to respect her skills over the years, but outside their tight-knit group, she constantly faced doubt about her abilities. Her commanding officer, Colonel Martinez, had pulled her aside the previous evening with troubling news. Satellite imagery showed a formation of enemy jets conducting reconnaissance flights dangerously close to their territory. The pattern suggested they were testing response times and mapping defensive positions. Intelligence believed a larger assault might be imminent, and every available pilot needed to be ready for immediate deployment. Sarah walked toward her F-16 Fighting Falcon, her boots echoing across the concrete. The ground crew had already completed their pre-flight checks, and the aircraft gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the hangar. She ran her hand along the smooth metal of the fuselage, feeling the slight vibration of the engines as the crew performed final system tests. This particular aircraft had become her trusted companion over dozens of missions, and she knew every sound, every slight tremor that indicated optimal performance. The radio in her helmet crackled to life as she climbed into the cockpit. All pilots report to briefing room immediately. Priority Alpha mission briefing in 10 minutes. Sarah's stomach dropped. Priority Alpha meant active combat deployment. She secured her aircraft and jogged toward the briefing room, her mind already shifting into combat mode. The briefing room buzzed with nervous energy as 12 pilots filed in. Colonel Martinez stood at the front, his expression grim. Behind him, a large screen displayed radar images and tactical maps. Sarah took her seat in the back row, noting the concerned whispers among her fellow pilots. Many of them had never seen actual combat, having joined during a period of relative peace. "Listen up, people," Colonel Martinez began, his voice cutting through the chatter. "We have confirmed enemy aircraft crossing into our airspace, 6 hostile fighters, advanced models, armed and dangerous. They've ignored all radio warnings and are continuing toward our coastal installations. Your mission is to intercept and neutralize the threat before they can reach populated areas." The room fell silent. Sarah felt her training kick in, her mind automatically processing the tactical information being presented. 6 enemy aircraft meant they would likely be outnumbered, as only 4 pilots from their squadron were certified for immediate combat deployment. The others were either too new or recovering from recent injuries. Colonel Martinez continued, outlining the mission parameters. The enemy formation was flying in a tight defensive pattern, suggesting experienced pilots. Their aircraft were equipped with advanced radar systems and air-to-air missiles. The engagement would take place over open ocean, minimizing risk to civilian populations, but also removing any possibility of ground-based support. As the briefing concluded, Sarah noticed several of her fellow pilots exchanging uncertain glances. Lieutenant Johnson, a promising young pilot with excellent simulator scores but no combat experience, looked particularly pale. Captain Williams, normally confident and boastful about his flying abilities, sat quietly, gripping his helmet with white knuckles. The squadron leader, Major Thompson, approached Colonel Martinez with obvious concern. Sarah couldn't hear their whispered conversation, but she saw the colonel shake his head firmly. Whatever Thompson had suggested, the answer was clearly no. The colonel gestured toward the assembled pilots, and Thompson nodded reluctantly as the pilots began to disperse toward their aircraft. Sarah overheard fragments of worried conversations. Some questioned whether they were ready for actual combat. Others wondered about the enemy's intentions and capabilities. The nervous energy in the room was almost tangible, and Sarah realized that despite their extensive training, most of her squadron mates had never faced the reality of life-or-death aerial combat. She made her way back to her aircraft, her mind focused on the technical aspects of the upcoming mission. The F-16 was a formidable fighter, but success would depend entirely on pilot skill and tactical awareness. Against 6 enemy aircraft, there would be no room for error. Every decision would need to be instantaneous and correct. The ground crew worked frantically to prepare all 4 aircraft for immediate departure. Fuel trucks rolled across the tarmac, and weapons specialists loaded air-to-air missiles onto the wing pylons. Sarah performed her own detailed inspection, checking missile guidance systems and cannon ammunition counts. In combat, mechanical failure could mean death. As she strapped herself into the cockpit for the second time that morning, Sarah felt the familiar transformation that occurred before every serious flight. Her breathing steadied, her mind cleared, and her hands moved. With automatic precision through the startup sequence, the twin engines roared to life behind her, their power vibrating through the entire aircraft. Radio chatter filled her headset as the 4-plane formation prepared for takeoff. Tower control provided final weather updates and confirmed radar contact with the approaching enemy formation. They had perhaps 30 minutes before intercept, barely enough time to reach optimal engagement altitude and position. Sarah taxied her aircraft toward the runway, following Major Thompson's lead fighter. Behind her, Lieutenant Johnson and Captain Williams completed the formation. As they approached the takeoff position, she caught sight of ground personnel lining the edges of the tarmac. Word had spread quickly through the base about the emergency deployment. Many of these people had never seen their pilots leave for actual combat. The tower cleared them for immediate takeoff. Thompson's aircraft surged forward first, followed by Sarah, then the other 2 fighters. As her F-16 lifted off the runway, Sarah felt the familiar rush of acceleration and the smooth transition from ground to air. Below, the airbase shrank rapidly, becoming a collection of tiny buildings surrounded by geometric patterns of runways and taxiways. She switched her radio to the tactical frequency and listened as Thompson coordinated with ground control. The enemy formation had maintained its course and speed, suggesting they either hadn't detected the intercepting fighters or were deliberately proceeding with their mission despite the threat. In her experience, that level of determination usually indicated highly trained, dangerous opponents. As the 4 American fighters climbed toward their assigned altitude, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading into something far more serious than a routine intercept mission. 20 minutes into the flight, Sarah's radar display lit up with multiple contacts. 6 enemy aircraft flying in perfect formation, exactly as intelligence had reported. They were still 50 miles away, but closing fast. The hostile fighters maintained radio silence, ignoring all attempts at communication from ground control. Their intentions were becoming increasingly clear. Major Thompson's voice crackled through the radio, calm and professional despite the circumstances. Eagle Flight, we have visual confirmation of hostile aircraft. Maintain formation and prepare for engagement. Remember your training, follow protocols, and watch each other's backs. Sarah checked her weapon systems one final time. 4 AIM-120 air-to-air missiles hung beneath her wings, along with a full load of cannon ammunition. Her radar was functioning perfectly, tracking the enemy formation with crystal clarity. The F-16's sophisticated targeting computer had already begun calculating intercept courses and optimal firing solutions. As they drew closer to the enemy formation, details became visible on the radar display. The hostile aircraft were flying in a defensive wall formation, designed to provide mutual support and maximum firepower coverage. This wasn't the formation of pilots conducting simple reconnaissance. These were combat veterans preparing for battle. Lieutenant Johnson's voice came through the radio tight with nervousness. Eagle 2 to Eagle Lead. Are we really going to engage 6 hostiles with only 4 aircraft? Shouldn't we request additional support? Major Thompson's response was immediate and firm. Negative, Eagle 2. No time for reinforcements. These hostiles are 12 minutes from our coastal installations. We stop them here or civilians die. Stay focused on your training. Sarah understood the mathematics of the situation. 6 against 4 represented terrible odds in aerial combat, where individual pilot skill often determined the outcome. But she also knew that their F-16s were among the most advanced fighters in the world. and their training had been extensive and rigorous. If they executed their tactics perfectly, they had a chance. The enemy formation suddenly changed course, turning directly toward the American fighters. Their radar signatures indicated they had detected the incoming interceptors and were moving to engage. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she realized this was no longer an intercept mission. It was going to be a full-scale dogfight. "All Eagles, break formation and engage at will," Thompson commanded. "Sarah, take the northern pair. Johnson, stay with Williams and handle the southern group. I'll take point and draw their fire." Sarah banked her aircraft hard to the left, climbing rapidly, to gain altitude advantage over her assigned targets. The two enemy fighters she was pursuing responded immediately, one climbing to match her altitude while the other dove low, attempting to set up a pincer attack. These pilots clearly knew what they were doing. The first enemy aircraft launched, a missile at maximum range, more to disrupt Sarah's attack than to achieve a kill. She rolled, inverted, and dove, using her aircraft's superior maneuverability to evade the incoming weapon. The missile streaked past her canopy, missing by less than 100 feet. Her heart pounded, but her hands remained steady on the controls. She pulled out of the dive and climbed again, this time approaching the enemy fighters from an unexpected angle. Her radar locked onto the lead aircraft, and she fired her first AM-120 missile. The weapon streaked away from her aircraft, its rocket motor leaving a thin trail of white smoke against the blue sky. The enemy pilot tried desperately to evade, dropping chaff and flares while executing violent evasive maneuvers. But Sarah's missile was too close and too well aimed. It struck the enemy fighter amidships, and the aircraft exploded in a brilliant orange fireball. 1 down, 5 to go. The second enemy fighter immediately turned toward Sarah, firing 2 missiles in rapid succession. She found herself in a deadly game of three-dimensional chess trying to evade incoming weapons while positioning for her own attack. The F-16 responded to her every input, rolling and climbing with mechanical precision. Radio chatter filled her headset as the battle expanded. Around her, she could hear Major Thompson engaging 2 enemy fighters simultaneously. His voice strained but controlled as he called out tactical information. Lieutenant Johnson sounded panicked, reporting that he was being pursued by a hostile aircraft, and couldn't shake it. Sarah completed a complex barrel roll that brought her behind the second enemy fighter. Her radar achieved lock and she fired again. This missile also found its target, sending another enemy aircraft spiraling toward the ocean in flames. But even as she celebrated the successful engagement, her radar warning receiver began screaming. Enemy fighter had maneuvered behind her while she was focused on her targets. Missile launch warning lights flashed red across her instrument panel. She had perhaps 3 seconds to evade before the incoming weapon reached her aircraft. Time seemed to slow as training and instinct took over. She rolled hard right while simultaneously pulling the aircraft into a steep climb, stressing the F-16 to its maximum performance limits. G-forces pressed her deep into her ejection seat, making it difficult to breathe or focus her vision. But the maneuver worked. The enemy missile passed beneath her aircraft, detonating harmlessly in the distance. Now she found herself in a turning battle with the enemy pilot, both aircraft circling tightly as each tried to gain position for a killing shot. This was where pilot skill mattered most. Technical specifications and missile counts became irrelevant when it came down to pure flying ability and tactical awareness. The enemy pilot was skilled, Sarah had to admit. He matched her turn for turn, never allowing her to gain the advantage she needed for a radar lock. But Sarah had one advantage he couldn't match. She knew these waters, this airspace, and the performance characteristics of her aircraft better than anyone. She executed a maneuver she had practiced hundreds of times, in training but never used in actual combat. Rolling inverted, she pulled the aircraft into a steep dive while simultaneously cutting power to her engines. To the enemy pilot, it would appear that she was retreating or possibly experiencing mechanical failure. The enemy pilot took the bait, diving after her and accelerating to catch what he believed was a damaged aircraft. But Sarah had been counting on this reaction. At the last possible moment, she rolled upright, advanced her throttles to full military power, and pulled into a crushing vertical climb. The enemy pilot found himself overshooting Sarah's position, suddenly vulnerable and exposed. Sarah's radar locked onto his aircraft and she fired her third missile at point-blank range. The enemy fighter disintegrated under the impact, its wreckage scattering across several square miles of ocean. 3. Down 3 to go, but as Sarah checked her fuel and ammunition status, she realized the battle was far from over. Her remaining missiles were limited, and the surviving enemy pilots had undoubtedly learned from watching their comrades' defeats. They would be more cautious now, more dangerous. Radio communication revealed that Major Thompson had successfully engaged and destroyed one enemy aircraft, but had taken damage in the process. His hydraulic systems were compromised, limiting his maneuverability. Lieutenant Johnson was still being pursued and was running low on fuel from extended evasive maneuvering. Captain Williams reported that he had lost radar contact with his assigned target and wasn't sure of the enemy aircraft's location. This was dangerous news. An unaccounted enemy fighter could appear anywhere, at any time, with devastating results. Sarah climbed to gain a better tactical overview of the battle space. From higher altitude, her radar could cover more area and provide better situational awareness. What she saw on her display made her blood run cold. The 2 remaining enemy fighters had regrouped and were now coordinating their attacks, using advanced tactics to isolate and destroy the American fighters one by one. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Sarah watched her radar display with growing concern as the remaining enemy fighters executed a coordinated attack pattern she had studied but never encountered in actual combat. They were using what military strategists called a hammer and anvil formation, with one aircraft driving targets toward the second, which would be positioned for the killing shot. Major Thompson's damaged F-16 was struggling to maintain altitude. Hydraulic fluid leaked from his aircraft in a thin stream, visible even from Sarah's position several miles away. His voice over the radio remained steady, but she could hear the strain as he fought to control his compromised aircraft. Eagle. 1 to all Eagles, I'm losing hydraulic pressure fast. Control systems are becoming unresponsive. I may need to withdraw from combat and attempt emergency landing. The words sent a chill through Sarah's spine. Losing their squadron leader in the middle of a complex engagement would leave the remaining pilots without their most experienced combat coordinator. But more immediately dangerous, Thompson's reduced capabilities made him a target the enemy pilots would certainly exploit. Lieutenant Johnson's panicked voice crackled through the radio. Eagle 2 to Eagle 1, I have a hostile on my tail and I can't shake him. My fuel is getting critical. Request immediate assistance. Sarah studied her tactical display, quickly calculating distances and intercept courses. Johnson was 20 miles south of her position, flying erratic evasive patterns while being pursued by one of the remaining enemy fighters. The hostile pilot was patient and methodical, staying just outside Johnson's cannon range while gradually forcing him into an increasingly desperate fuel situation. Captain Williams had gone silent on the radio, which was never a good sign in aerial combat. His last transmission had reported losing contact with his assigned target, but Sarah's radar showed no friendly aircraft in his last known position. Either his radio was malfunctioning, or something worse had happened. The remaining enemy fighters were demonstrating tactical sophistication that surprised even Sarah's experienced combat instincts. Instead of pursuing individual targets aggressively, they were coordinating their attacks to create multiple simultaneous threats. This forced the American pilots to split their attention and make defensive rather than offensive decisions. Sarah made a command decision that went against standard engagement protocols. Rather than maintaining her assigned patrol area, she turned her aircraft toward Johnson's position at maximum speed. Her afterburners roared to life, pushing the F-16 beyond normal cruise limits as she raced to assist her squadron mate. The enemy pilot pursuing Johnson had positioned himself perfectly, staying in the F-16's blind spot while gradually closing the distance. Johnson's evasive maneuvers were becoming increasingly erratic as fuel depletion affected his aircraft's performance. Sarah could see on her radar that he had perhaps 5 minutes of fuel remaining before he would be forced to break off combat and head for the nearest airfield. As she approached the engagement area, Sarah switched her radar to air-to-air combat mode and began searching for the optimal attack angle. The enemy fighter was so focused on Johnson that he hadn't detected Sarah's approach. This gave her a crucial tactical advantage, but only for a few more seconds. She achieved radar lock at maximum missile range and immediately fired her fourth and final aim 120. The weapon streaked toward the unsuspecting enemy aircraft, its sophisticated guidance system tracking the target with deadly precision. The enemy pilot detected the incoming missile at the last possible moment, but his evasive maneuvers came too late. The missile struck his aircraft dead center, destroying it in a spectacular explosion. "Eagle 2, you're clear," Sarah transmitted. "Head for base immediately. You don't have fuel for extended combat." Johnson's voice came back filled with relief and gratitude. "Thanks, Eagle 4. I owe you one. Heading home now." But Sarah's relief was short-lived. Her weapons display showed a sobering reality. No missiles remaining, only cannon ammunition. Against the sophisticated aircraft flown by the remaining enemy pilots, her 20mm cannon would be effective only at very close range, and only if she could maneuver into the perfect firing position. Major Thompson's situation had become critical. His hydraulic systems had failed completely, forcing him to rely on manual flight controls that responded sluggishly to his inputs. The remaining enemy fighter had detected his vulnerability and was moving to exploit it, approaching from Thompson's blind spot with deadly intent. Sarah pushed her F-16 to its absolute performance limits, climbing rapidly while turning toward Thompson's position. Her radar showed the enemy aircraft closing on her squadron leader, probably preparing for a missile shot that Thompson's damaged aircraft couldn't evade. Time was running out. The enemy pilot fired just as Sarah reached maximum cannon range. She watched Thompson's aircraft attempt a desperate evasive maneuver, rolling inverted and diving toward the ocean surface. But with his compromised control systems, the maneuver was too slow and too predictable. Sarah opened fire with her cannon, sending a stream of 20mm rounds toward the enemy fighter. Her first burst missed, passing just behind the aircraft's tail section. The enemy pilot immediately began evasive action, rolling and climbing to escape Sarah's attack. But Sarah had anticipated this reaction. She had studied enemy tactical manuals and knew their standard evasive procedures. As the hostile aircraft rolled left, she adjusted her aim and fired again. This time her rounds found their target, striking the enemy fighter's wing and engine section. The enemy aircraft began trailing smoke and losing altitude, but it wasn't completely disabled. The pilot maintained some control and was attempting to disengage from combat. Sarah knew she couldn't allow this. A damaged but still functional enemy aircraft could return with reinforcements or attack other targets. She pursued the smoking fighter, staying close despite the obvious risks. At such short range, any mistake would be fatal for both aircraft. The enemy pilot was skilled and experienced, using every trick in the manual to escape Sarah's pursuit. The chase extended across 30 miles of ocean, with both aircraft flying at dangerously low altitude. Sarah's fuel was becoming a concern, but she couldn't break off the engagement. This enemy pilot had nearly killed Major Thompson and had demonstrated advanced combat skills throughout the engagement. Finally, the damage to the enemy aircraft became too severe to maintain controlled flight. Sarah watched as the hostile fighter began an uncontrollable descent toward the ocean. The pilot ejected at the last moment, his parachute deploying just before his aircraft struck the water. 5 enemy fighters destroyed, 1 remaining. But as Sarah turned her attention back to the larger battle, her radar display showed something that made her heart sink. Captain Williams's aircraft appeared briefly on her screen, then vanished again. The intermittent radar contact suggested his aircraft was severely damaged, or that his electronic systems were failing. The final enemy fighter had apparently been engaging Williams during Sarah's pursuit of the damaged aircraft. Now Williams was missing, possibly shot down, and 1 hostile aircraft remained in the combat area. Sarah's fuel gauge showed she had perhaps 15 minutes of flight time remaining before she would be forced to return to base. Her ammunition was nearly exhausted with fewer than 50 cannon rounds remaining. Against a fully armed enemy fighter, these limitations put her at a severe disadvantage. Radio attempts to contact Williams yielded only static. Either his radio was completely disabled, or worse. Sarah knew she had to find and engage the remaining enemy aircraft, both to complete the mission and to determine what had happened to her squadron mate. Her radar swept the combat area methodically, searching for any sign of the final hostile fighter. The enemy pilot was undoubtedly aware that 5 of his comrades had been shot down, and he would be operating with extreme caution. This made him both more dangerous and more difficult to locate. As Sarah continued her search, she realized that this final engagement would likely determine the success or failure of the entire mission. The enemy aircraft was still within range of civilian targets, and if it escaped the immediate combat area, it could attack coastal installations before additional interceptors could be scrambled. Sarah's radar screen remained ominously empty as she swept the area where Captain Williams had last been detected. The silence from his radio was deafening, and she found herself imagining the worst-case scenarios that every combat pilot dreaded. Williams had been a competent pilot, not brilliant but steady and reliable. The fact that he had vanished so completely suggested the final enemy aircraft was more dangerous than the others. She reduced power to extend her fuel range and began a systematic search pattern, flying in gradually expanding circles from Williams's last known position. Her radar was set to maximum sensitivity, searching for any metallic object that might indicate either Williams's aircraft or the remaining enemy fighter. The ocean below stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface reflecting the afternoon sun like a vast mirror. After 10 minutes of fruitless searching, Sarah detected a weak radar return approximately 15 miles northeast of her position. The contact was intermittent and difficult to track, suggesting either a damaged aircraft flying at very low altitude or debris floating on the ocean surface. She turned toward the contact, advancing her throttles to military power. As she approached the radar return, Sarah's heart sank. Scattered pieces of aircraft wreckage floated on the ocean surface, along with what appeared to be an empty life raft. The debris field was extensive, indicating a catastrophic aircraft destruction rather than a controlled crash landing. Captain Williams hadn't made it out, but Sarah's grief was interrupted by her radar warning receiver, which suddenly began screaming in her headset. The final enemy fighter had been using Williams' crash site as bait, hiding in the radar clutter near the ocean surface. Now it was climbing rapidly behind Sarah's position, attempting to achieve missile lock. Sarah immediately went into defensive mode, rolling her aircraft inverted and diving toward the ocean while deploying chaff and flares to confuse enemy missiles. Her altitude rapidly decreased as she sought the protection of ground clutter, where the enemy's radar would have difficulty maintaining target lock. The hostile pilot was patient and methodical, following Sarah's descent but staying outside her cannon range. He was clearly waiting for the optimal moment to fire, when Sarah would be too low to execute effective evasive maneuvers. This was a deadly game of three-dimensional chess, with the ocean surface as the ultimate boundary. At 200 feet, above the waves, Sarah pulled out of her dive and began flying straight and level, maintaining just enough altitude to avoid hitting the water during high-speed maneuvering. The enemy aircraft matched her altitude, staying approximately 2 miles behind and slightly above her position. Both pilots were now flying in the most dangerous possible conditions, where any mistake would result in immediate death. Sarah's fuel warning light illuminated on her instrument panel. She had perhaps 8 minutes of flight time remaining before her engines would begin flaming out. The enemy pilot undoubtedly knew this and was simply waiting for her fuel situation to force her into increasingly desperate tactics. She needed to change the tactical equation dramatically, and she had an idea that was either brilliant or suicidal. Sarah began a series of seemingly erratic maneuvers, rolling left and right while varying her speed and altitude randomly. To the enemy pilot, it would appear that she was panicking or that her aircraft was experiencing control problems. The hostile fighter began closing the distance, probably preparing to finish off what appeared to be a disabled opponent. Sarah continued her erratic flight path, gradually leading the enemy aircraft toward a small island that appeared on her navigation display. The island was uninhabited, but featured steep cliffs that rose several hundred feet above sea level. As they approached the island, Sarah suddenly rolled inverted and pulled her aircraft into the steepest climb her F-16 could sustain. The maneuver was so violent that she briefly lost consciousness from the G-forces, but when her vision cleared, she found herself above and behind the enemy fighter. The hostile pilot had been caught completely off guard by Sarah's sudden maneuver. He had been expecting a damaged aircraft to continue flying erratically at low altitude, not to suddenly execute a perfect combat maneuver. By the time he realized what had happened, Sarah was already lining up for a cannon shot. She fired her remaining ammunition in one continuous burst, walking her rounds across the enemy aircraft's fuselage and wing sections. The 20mm shells struck, with devastating effect, severing control cables and puncturing fuel tanks. The enemy fighter immediately began trailing fire and smoke, its pilot struggling to maintain control. But Sarah's victory was short-lived. Her fuel warning system began chiming continuously, indicating that her engines were about to flame out. She had perhaps 2 minutes of powered flight remaining, barely enough time to clear the island and find a suitable ditching site in the open ocean. The enemy aircraft was also in desperate condition, losing altitude rapidly as its pilot fought to keep it airborne. Sarah watched as the hostile fighter attempted an emergency landing on the island's small beach, but the approach angle was too steep and too fast. The aircraft struck the shoreline at high speed, exploding in a fireball that sent black smoke billowing into the sky. 6 enemy fighters destroyed. Mission accomplished. But Sarah's own situation had become critical. Her fuel gauges showed empty, and her engines were beginning to surge and sputter as they consumed the last drops of aviation fuel. She turned her aircraft toward the open ocean, looking for the smoothest water she could find for an emergency ditching. At 500 feet altitude, her left engine flamed out completely. The F-16 immediately began yawing to the right as asymmetric thrust tried to roll the aircraft inverted. Sarah compensated with rudder and aileron inputs, but she knew she had only seconds before the remaining engine also failed. She activated her emergency locator beacon and transmitted her final position to any aircraft that might be monitoring the emergency frequency. Major Thompson's damaged F-16 was probably still limping home, and Lieutenant Johnson should be approaching their home airfield by now. But Sarah was alone over the ocean, with no possibility of rescue reaching her before she had to abandon her aircraft. Her right engine flamed out just as she crossed the coastline of a small, uninhabited island. Sarah found herself flying a powerless glider, with only her aircraft's momentum and aerodynamic efficiency to keep her airborne. She had perhaps 30 seconds to find a suitable landing site before the F-16's glide characteristics forced her to eject. The island featured a small beach flanked by rocky cliffs, similar to where the final enemy aircraft had crashed. But Sarah's approach angle was shallower, and her aircraft was still under control despite the lack of engine power. She extended her landing gear and flaps, configuring the F-16 for the slowest possible touchdown speed. The beach was narrow and short, barely long enough for a fighter aircraft traveling at landing speed. Sarah would have only one chance to get the approach right. Too fast or too high and she would overshoot into the rocks. Too slow or too low and she would hit the water short of the beach. She aimed for the very beginning of the beach, knowing that her aircraft would probably run off the far end, but hoping to minimize the impact forces. The F-16 touched down hard on the sand, its landing gear immediately sinking into the soft surface. The aircraft decelerated rapidly, throwing Sarah forward against her restraint harness. The F-16 slid across the entire length of the beach and into the rocks at the far end, its landing gear collapsing and its nose section crumpling. But the cockpit section remained intact, and Sarah found herself conscious and apparently uninjured despite the violent crash landing. She shut down all aircraft systems and activated her survival radio, then sat quietly in her damaged cockpit for a moment, hardly believing she had survived the engagement. 6 enemy fighters destroyed, her squadron mates safe, and civilian targets protected. The mission had been successful, but at a terrible cost. As Sarah began the process of exiting her damaged aircraft, she reflected on the events of the past hour. She had engaged and defeated multiple enemy fighters in single combat, something that few pilots in history had ever accomplished. But she felt no sense of triumph, only exhaustion and grief for Captain Williams. Sarah sat in her damaged cockpit for several minutes, allowing her heart rate to return to normal and checking herself for injuries. The crash landing had been violent, but her ejection seat and safety harness had done their job. She had a few bruises and a cut on her forehead where her helmet had struck the canopy frame, but nothing that seemed serious. The F-16's cockpit was tilted at an odd angle, with the aircraft's nose buried deep in the rocky terrain at the end of the beach. Electrical systems had failed completely in the crash, leaving Sarah in silence for the first time in hours. The absence of radio chatter and engine noise felt strange after the intense combat engagement. She activated her personal survival radio and began transmitting on the emergency frequency. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Eagle 4. I am down on a small island approximately 40 miles northeast of base. Aircraft is destroyed, but I am uninjured and have survival gear. Request search and rescue." The response came immediately, crackling through the small radio's speaker. "Eagle 4, this is Rescue Control. We copy your mayday and have been monitoring your situation. Major Thompson reported you missing after the engagement. Search aircraft are already en route to your position." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. She wasn't going to be stranded on this uninhabited island indefinitely. But the radio controller's next words brought back the grief she had been trying to suppress. "Eagle 4, we need to confirm the status of Eagle 3. Major Thompson reported Captain Williams as missing during the engagement. Can you provide any information about his location or condition?" Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath before responding. "Rescue Control, Eagle 3 is confirmed KIA. I located his crash site during the final engagement. There was no survivor beacon, and the wreckage pattern indicated catastrophic aircraft destruction." The radio fell silent for several seconds before the controller responded. "Copy, Eagle 4. We'll pass that information to command. Your pickup ETA is approximately 20 minutes. Can you signal your position for the rescue helicopter?" Sarah looked around her immediate area and spotted her aircraft's emergency flare kit, which had survived the crash landing. She extracted several flares and smoke signals, then carefully climbed out of her damaged cockpit onto the beach. Her legs felt unsteady after the stress of combat and the crash, but she was able to walk normally. The island was smaller than it had appeared from the air, perhaps half a mile long and a few hundred yards wide. Rocky cliffs dominated most of its perimeter, with the small beach where she had landed being the only flat area suitable for aircraft operations. The wreckage of the final enemy fighter was visible on the opposite end of the beach, still sending up a thin column of black smoke. As Sarah waited for rescue, she reflected on the events of the past few hours. When she had awakened that morning, she had been just another pilot in the squadron, respected by her immediate colleagues but largely unknown outside her unit. Now she had single-handedly destroyed 6 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, something that would certainly attract attention from higher command levels. The sound of helicopter rotors approaching interrupted her thoughts. A rescue helicopter appeared over the cliffs, its crew scanning the beach for signs of the downed pilot. Sarah ignited a smoke flare and waved it overhead, clearly marking her position on the small beach. The helicopter settled onto the sand near Sarah's position, its rotor wash kicking up clouds of grit and debris. 2 rescue specialists jumped out and jogged toward her, medical equipment in hand. Their first concern was her physical condition, but after a quick examination, they confirmed that her injuries were minor and didn't require immediate treatment. "Ma'am, we need to get you back to base as quickly as possible," one of the rescuers told her. "Command wants to debrief you immediately about the engagement. From what we heard on the radio, you had quite a battle out here." Sarah nodded and followed the rescue team to their helicopter. As they lifted off from the beach, she looked down at her wrecked F-16, feeling a sense of loss for the aircraft that had served her so well during the combat engagement. The fighter had brought her through 6 separate aerial battles and delivered her safely to the island despite running out of fuel. The helicopter flight back to base took 15 minutes, during which Sarah stared out at the ocean and tried to process